The bullet missed Garrett Pike's heart by 3 inches, which was exactly how much he had leaned forward to adjust his bootstrap when Ruby Lancaster pulled the trigger on that scorching afternoon in Taylor, Texas, in the summer of 1882. The whole town heard the shot, saw Garrett stumble backward into the horse trough, and within minutes half of Taylor believed Ruby had committed cold-blooded murder while the other half suspended judgment until someone fished Garrett out of the water. What nobody expected was that Garrett Pike would sit up sputtering and cursing, very much alive, or that he would immediately start telling anyone who would listen that Ruby had tried to kill him over absolutely nothing, which was the first of many lies he would tell that day. Ruby stood on the porch of the general store with her father's old revolver still smoking in her hand, her auburn hair coming loose from its pins, her chest heaving with terror and rage, and the sick realization that she had just shot a man in broad daylight in front of God and everyone in Taylor. She had not meant to shoot him at all. She had meant to fire a warning shot into the dirt, meant to scare him away, meant to make him stop saying those vile things about her sister who had been dead for barely 3 months. But Garrett had lunged toward her at the exact wrong moment, and the bullet that should have kicked up dust at his feet had instead torn through his shoulder and sent him flying backward. "He's alive," someone shouted, and Ruby felt her knees go weak with relief even as Marshal Donnelly came running down the street with his gun drawn. "Ruby Lancaster, you drop that weapon right now," Donnelly barked, and Ruby let the revolver fall from her shaking fingers. It clattered on the wooden planks of the porch, and she raised her hands slowly, her whole body trembling. "He was saying terrible things," Ruby said, her voice breaking. "He was lying about Sarah, about what happened to her, and I could not let him keep spreading those lies." "That does not give you the right to shoot a man," Donnelly said, but his voice was gentler now. He had known Ruby since she was a little girl, had known her sister Sarah too, and he knew the Lancaster family had been through hell these past months. Garrett Pike was on his feet now, soaking wet and bleeding from the shoulder, his face twisted with theatrical agony. "She tried to murder me," he shouted, loud enough for everyone gathering in the street to hear. "I was just standing there minding my own business, and she came out shooting like a mad woman. I want her arrested. I want her hanged." "Nobody's getting hanged," Donnelly said firmly. "Ruby, you're going to have to come with me to the jailhouse while we sort this out." Ruby nodded numbly, letting the marshal take her by the arm and lead her away. Behind her, she could hear Garrett still shouting about murder and justice, and she could feel the eyes of the entire town on her back. She had lived in Taylor her whole life, all 22 years of it, and she had never caused a moment of trouble until today. Now she would be remembered as the woman who shot Garrett Pike, whether he lived or died. The jailhouse was a small building at the end of Main Street, built of rough limestone blocks that stayed cool even in the brutal Texas heat. Donnelly settled Ruby into one of the 2 cells with surprising gentleness, then went to fetch the doctor for Garrett's shoulder. Ruby sat on the narrow cot and stared at her hands, which were still shaking. She could not believe what she had done. She was not a violent person. She had never fired a gun at another human being in her life. But when Garrett had stood there in the street, drunk at 3 in the afternoon, shouting for everyone to hear that Sarah Lancaster had been a whore who got what she deserved, something inside Ruby had simply snapped. Sarah had not been a whore. Sarah had been sweet and trusting and desperately in love with a man who had promised to marry her and then disappeared the moment he learned she was carrying his child. Sarah had died trying to end her own pregnancy with a knitting needle and a bottle of gin, alone in her room while Ruby was at the market buying flour. Ruby had found her sister's body, had held Sarah while the life bled out of her, had screamed for help that came too late. That had been 3 months ago, and the grief was still so raw that some days Ruby could barely breathe around it. And now Garrett Pike, who had never spoken 2 words to Sarah while she was alive, was spreading rumors that Sarah had been sleeping with half the men in town, that she had brought shame on her family, that her death was God's judgment. None of it was true, not one word. But lies spread faster than truth in a small town, and Ruby had listened to the whispers for as long as she could bear before she finally broke. She did not know how long she sat there in the cell before she heard the jailhouse door open again. She looked up expecting Marshal Donnelly, but instead she saw a tall man she did not recognize, with dark hair and eyes the color of creek water in winter. He was dressed like a cowboy, with worn leather chaps and a dusty hat he removed as he stepped inside. He looked at Ruby through the bars with an expression that was hard to read. "Miss Lancaster?" he said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle. "Yes," Ruby said, rising to her feet. "Who are you?" "My name is Austin Merrick," the man said. "I just rode into town about an hour ago. I was stabling my horse when I heard what happened in the street." "Then you know I shot a man," Ruby said flatly. "I am not denying it." "I know Garrett Pike is saying you shot him," Austin said carefully, "but I also know Garrett Pike is a liar." Ruby stared at him. "You know Garrett?" "I know of him," Austin said. "I've been tracking him for the better part of a month. He's wanted in 3 counties for fraud and theft." Ruby felt her heart start to pound. "You're a bounty hunter?" "I prefer to think of myself as someone who brings people to justice," Austin said with a slight smile. "But yes, I suppose that's accurate, and right now I'm very interested in the fact that Garrett Pike is telling everyone in town that you tried to murder him without provocation. That's quite a serious charge, Miss Lancaster. If he presses it, you could hang." "I know," Ruby whispered. The reality of her situation was starting to sink in, and it was terrifying. But I was not trying to murder him. I was trying to scare him. He was saying horrible things about my sister, things that were not true, and I just wanted him to stop. "What kind of things?" Austin asked, his eyes intent on her face. Ruby felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. He was saying that Sarah was a woman of loose morals, that she had been with many men, that her death was her own fault for living in sin. But none of that was true. Sarah was in love with one man, a man who promised to marry her and then abandoned her when she needed him most. She died trying to hide her shame, trying to spare our family from scandal. And Garrett knew none of it. He was just spreading lies because he could, because he enjoyed causing pain. Austin was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "Did anyone else hear what Garrett said to you before you fired?" "I don't know," Ruby admitted. "Maybe. There were people on the street, but everyone was focused on the shooting afterward. I don't know if anyone heard what came before." "That's a problem," Austin said, "because right now the town only has Garrett's version of events. And in his version, you're a murderous madwoman who shot an innocent man in cold blood." "I shot a guilty man in hot blood," Ruby said bitterly. "But I suppose that does not make much difference in the eyes of the law." "Actually, it makes all the difference," Austin said. "If we can prove that Garrett provoked you, that he said things calculated to cause you emotional distress, then what you did could be considered a crime of passion. That's not murder, Miss Lancaster. That's something much less serious. You might still face charges, but you would not hang." "How do we prove it?" Ruby asked desperately. "How do we prove what he said when it's just my word against his?" Austin smiled, and there was something wolfish in the expression. "We prove that Garrett Pike is a liar by showing everyone exactly what kind of man he is. I have warrants for his arrest. I have testimony from 3 women in 3 different towns who can describe exactly how he cheated them. I have evidence that he's been using false names and fake documents to steal money from vulnerable people. If I can get him in front of a judge, I can destroy his credibility completely. And once the town knows what kind of man he really is, they'll be much more likely to believe your version of events." Ruby felt a flicker of hope for the first time since the shooting. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "I know you're scared," Austin said quietly. "I know you're grieving your sister, and I know what it's like to watch someone you love be destroyed by lies while you're powerless to stop it. My mother was accused of theft by a man she worked for, a man who had actually stolen the money himself and needed someone to blame. She went to prison for 2 years before the truth came out. She was never the same after that. So when I see someone like Garrett Pike spreading lies that could get an innocent woman killed, I don't need to know her to want to help. Ruby felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing me." "I haven't known you long enough to believe you or not believe you," Austin said honestly, "but I know Garrett Pike is a criminal and a liar, and I know his version of events doesn't add up. He says you tried to murder him, but you shot him in the shoulder. If you wanted him dead, you would have aimed for his chest or his head. And he says it was unprovoked, but he's been in town less than a week and he's already making enemies. Someone who behaves like that is usually hiding something." Marshal Donnelly returned then, looking harried and annoyed. "Austin Merrick," he said, recognizing the bounty hunter. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here about Garrett Pike," Austin said, producing a folded paper from his jacket. "I have a warrant for his arrest out of Travis County, fraud, theft, and obtaining money under false pretenses. I'd like to take him into custody." Donnelly took the warrant and read it carefully, his eyebrows rising. "Well, I'll be damned. Garrett Pike is a con man?" "One of the best," Austin said. "Or one of the worst, depending on how you look at it. He's stolen nearly $10,000 from widows and spinsters across central Texas in the past year. I've been on his trail for weeks." "He can't exactly travel right now," Donnelly said. "Doc Miller just finished digging the bullet out of his shoulder. He's over at the boarding house, sedated with laudanum and complaining about everything under the sun." "Then he'll be easy to arrest," Austin said with satisfaction. "I'll take him to Austin as soon as he's fit to travel. In the meantime, I think we should hold off on pressing charges against Miss Lancaster until we know more about the circumstances of the shooting." "She admitted to it," Donnelly said, but he sounded uncertain now. "She shot him in front of half the town." "She defended herself against a man who was harassing her," Austin corrected. "A man who, I might add, is a known criminal with a history of manipulating and lying to women. I think a judge might be very interested to hear about that context." Donnelly looked at Ruby, then at Austin, then back at Ruby again. "I'm not letting her out of that cell until I'm sure she's not a danger to anyone," he said finally. "But I'll hold off on sending for the circuit judge until we have the full story. That's the best I can do." "That's all I'm asking," Austin said. "Give me a day or two to gather evidence and talk to witnesses. I think you'll find that this situation is a lot more complicated than it appears." After Austin left, Ruby sat back down on the cot and tried to process everything that had just happened. A bounty hunter had ridden into town, discovered that the man she shot was a wanted criminal, and was now working to prove that Garrett had provoked her. It seemed too good to be true, like something out of a dime novel. But Austin Merrick had seemed genuine in his desire to help, and the look in his eyes when he talked about his mother's false imprisonment had been real grief. Ruby wondered what it would be like to have someone like Austin Merrick on her side. He was clearly intelligent and capable, and there was something steady about him that made her feel safer even locked in a jail cell. He was also handsome in a rugged way that made her heart beat a little faster, though she told herself firmly that this was not the time to be thinking about such things. She had just shot a man. She was facing possible murder charges. Romance was the furthest thing from her mind. Except it was not, quite. Because when Austin had looked at her through the bars with those Winter Creek eyes, she had felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been frozen since Sarah's death. For just a moment she had felt alive again. She pushed the thought away and lay down on the cot, staring at the ceiling. Outside she could hear the sounds of Taylor going about its business, horses clopping down Main Street, the blacksmith's hammer ringing on the anvil, children shouting as they played in the dust, normal life continuing while Ruby's own life hung in the balance. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the only words that came to her were a desperate plea for help, repeated over and over like a heartbeat. The next morning, Austin returned with news. Ruby was awake and pacing the cell, too anxious to sleep, when he walked in with Marshal Donnelly. "We arrested Garrett Pike this morning," Austin said without preamble. "He tried to leave town before dawn, shoulder wound and all. That's consciousness of guilt if I ever saw it." "Where is he now?" Ruby asked. "In the other cell," Donnelly said, jerking his thumb toward the second cell, which was around a corner, and out of Ruby's line of sight, screaming about illegal arrest and violation of his rights, but the warrant is solid, and he's not going anywhere. I also talked to some people who were on the street yesterday, Austin continued. The milliner, Mrs. Chen, says she heard Garrett shouting about your sister before the shot was fired. She says he was using language that would make a sailor blush, and that you told him to stop several times before you pulled the gun. Ruby felt relief wash over her jaw. Mrs. Chen will testify to that? She already has, Austin said. I took her statement this morning. And I found 2 other witnesses who heard at least part of what Garrett said. They all agree that he was being verbally abusive and that you were defending your sister's honor. That still does not make it legal to shoot someone, Donnelly pointed out, but he sounded less stern than before. No, but it does make it understandable, Austin said. And it establishes that Garrett Pike was lying when he said the shooting was unprovoked. He provoked Miss Lancaster deliberately, and she reacted in a moment of extreme emotional distress. That's not murder. That's not even attempted murder. At worst, it's assault with a deadly weapon, and given the circumstances, I think most judges would be inclined to show leniency. What about Garrett's lies about my sister? Ruby asked. Can he be punished for that? Slander is a civil matter, not a criminal one, Austin said gently. You could sue him for damages, but given that he's about to go to prison for fraud, I doubt you'd ever see a penny. The best revenge is that everyone in town now knows he's a liar and a thief. His reputation is destroyed. Ruby supposed that would have to be enough. Sarah was beyond caring what anyone said about her now, and Ruby's own reputation would recover in time. What mattered was that she was not going to hang for defending her sister's memory. So what happens now? She asked. Now we wait for the circuit judge to arrive, Donnelly said. He's due in Taylor in 3 days. He'll hear both cases, yours and Garrett's, and make a ruling. In the meantime, you'll both stay locked up. Can I at least have some books? Ruby asked, or writing paper? I'll go mad if I have to sit in here with nothing to do for 3 days. I'll see what I can do, Donnelly said, and to Ruby's surprise, he almost smiled. You're not a hardened criminal, Ruby. I know that. We just have to follow the law. After Donnelly left to make his rounds, Austin lingered by the cell. How are you holding up? He asked. Better than yesterday, Ruby admitted. Thanks to you. I don't know what I would have done if you had not shown up when you did. You would have found a way, Austin said. You're stronger than you think. I don't feel strong, Ruby said softly. I feel like I'm falling apart. Ever since Sarah died, I've been barely holding on, and now this. Grief takes time, Austin said. My mother was never the same after prison, but she did eventually heal. She found new purpose, new joy. It just took longer than she expected. Is she still alive? Ruby asked. No, Austin said quietly. She died 4 years ago, pneumonia. But she had 10 good years after she got out of prison, years where she was happy and at peace. I think about that when things get dark, that even after the worst happens, there can still be good years ahead. Ruby felt tears slide down her cheeks. She was not normally a woman who cried easily, but the stress of the past day combined with Austin's kindness was too much. I'm sorry, she said, wiping at her face. I'm not usually this weepy. You're entitled, Austin said. You've been through hell. So have you, Ruby pointed out. But you're not falling apart. I fell apart plenty when my mother was in prison, Austin said. I was 16 years old, and I thought the world was ending. But I learned that you can survive things you never thought possible. And then you get up, and you keep going because that's what life requires. They talked for another hour. Austin standing outside the bars and Ruby sitting on the cot. And Ruby found herself telling him things she had not told anyone else. About how guilty she felt for not being there when Sarah needed her. About how angry she was at the man who had abandoned her sister. About how scared she was of being alone now that Sarah was gone. Austin listened without judgment, offering comfort where he could and honest silence when words would not help. By the time he left, Ruby felt lighter than she had in months. It was strange how a conversation with a near stranger could be more healing than weeks of well-meaning but awkward condolences from people who had known her all her life. Over the next 3 days, Austin visited Ruby every morning, And every evening, bringing her books and newspapers and fresh food from the restaurant because Marshall Donnelly's cooking was, in Austin's words, a crime against humanity. They talked about everything and nothing. Ruby learned that Austin was 28 years old, that he had been a bounty hunter for 6 years, that he had a younger sister in San Antonio who was married to a school teacher. Austin learned that Ruby loved to read, that she had taught herself basic bookkeeping to help her father with his business before he died, that she dreamed of someday opening her own shop. They also talked about more serious things, about justice and mercy, about whether Ruby should have handled the situation differently, about what Sarah would have wanted her sister to do. She would have wanted you to live, Austin said on the third evening, when Ruby was spiraling into guilt about the shooting. She would not have wanted you to destroy your life over defending her memory. I know, Ruby said. But in that moment, I was not thinking about consequences. I was just so angry. Garrett was standing there lying about her, and everyone was listening, and I couldn't stand it. Anger is not a sin, Austin said. It's what you do with it that matters. And yes, shooting Garrett was not the wisest choice, but it was not murder. It was a mistake made in a moment of passionate grief. The law understands the difference. I hope the judge does, Ruby said quietly. The judge arrived on the fourth day, a stern-looking man named Horace Blackwell, who had a reputation for fairness but no tolerance for nonsense. The trial was held in the church since Taylor did not have a proper courthouse, and the entire town turned out to watch. Ruby stood before the judge in her best dress, which Marshall Donnelly had fetched from her house, and tried not to shake. Garrett Pike was brought in first, still favoring his wounded shoulder and wearing a look of theatrical suffering. The judge listened to the charges against him, examined the warrants and evidence that Austin had gathered, and pronounced him guilty of fraud and theft. Garrett was sentenced to 5 years in the state prison in Huntsville, and he was dragged out of the church screaming about corruption and injustice. Then it was Ruby's turn. She stood before Judge Blackwell and listened as Marshall Donnelly described the shooting. Then Austin stood and presented the testimony of the witnesses who had heard Garrett's verbal abuse. He described Garrett's character, his history of lying and manipulating women, his pattern of behavior that suggested he had been deliberately trying to provoke Ruby. Miss Lancaster acted in a moment of extreme emotional distress, Austin said. She had just lost her sister in tragic circumstances, and Mr. Pike was publicly slandering the deceased with lies calculated to cause maximum pain. While Miss Lancaster's actions were not legal, they were understandable and human. She is not a danger to society. She is a grieving woman who made a terrible mistake. The judge looked at Ruby for a long moment. Miss Lancaster, do you have anything to say in your own defense? Ruby took a deep breath. Your Honor, I am deeply sorry for what I did. I should not have brought a gun into the street. I should not have fired at Mr. Pike even to scare him. I let my grief and anger control me, and I nearly killed a man because of it. I will have to live with that for the rest of my life. But I want you to know that I was not trying to murder him. I was trying to make him stop lying about my sister. Sarah was a good person who made one mistake and paid for it with her life. She did not deserve to have her memory destroyed by a man who never even knew her. I could not let that stand. I would ask the court for mercy, not because I think I deserve it, but because I promise you I have learned from this, and I will never let my emotions drive me to violence again. Judge Blackwell nodded slowly. Miss Lancaster, I find you guilty of assault with a deadly weapon. However, given the extenuating circumstances, I am sentencing you to 6 months of probation and a fine of $50. If you stay out of trouble for those 6 months, the charge will be expunged from your record. Do you understand? Ruby felt her knees go weak with relief. Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Don't thank me, the judge said sternly. Thank the people who testified on your behalf, and thank whatever angel brought Mr. Merrick to town when he did. And Miss Lancaster, I am truly sorry for your loss. No young woman should have to endure what your sister endured. I hope you find peace. Ruby nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Marshall Donnelly led her out of the church, and back to the jailhouse to collect her things, and then she was free, just like that. After 4 days in a cell, expecting the worst, she was walking out into the sunlight with nothing worse than a fine and 6 months of probation. Austin was waiting for her outside the jailhouse, his horse saddled and ready to ride. "I have to take Garrett to Huntsville," he said, "but I'll be back in a week or so. Will you be all right until then?" Ruby looked at him. This stranger who had appeared in her life at exactly the right moment and saved her from a terrible fate. "I'll be fine," she said. "But Austin, I want to see you again. Not because you saved me, but because I want to know you better. Is that all right?" Austin smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "That's more than all right," he said. "That's the best thing anyone said to me in a very long time." He reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently before swinging up into the saddle. Ruby watched him ride away down Main Street with Garrett Pike in chains behind him, and she felt something unfurl in her chest, something that felt almost like hope. The week Austin was gone felt longer than the 4 days Ruby had spent in jail. She went back to her little house on the edge of town, the house she had shared with Sarah and their father before he died, and tried to put her life back together. Neighbors came by with food and sympathy, and to Ruby's relief, most of them seemed to believe her version of events. Garrett Pike's reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that few people took his accusations seriously anymore. Mrs. Chen, the milliner who had testified on Ruby's behalf, became a regular visitor. She was a tiny woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and she did not mince words about what she thought of Garrett Pike. "That man was poison," she said as she helped Ruby clean the house. "I knew it the moment he set foot in town. He had that look about him, you know? Like he thought he was better than everyone else. And the things he said about your sister, may she rest in peace. Unforgivable." "Thank you for testifying," Ruby said. "I don't think I would have gotten off so lightly without your statement." "You should not have been charged at all," Mrs. Chen said firmly. "Any woman would have done the same in your position. Sarah was a sweet girl. What happened to her was a tragedy, not a scandal. That young man who got her in trouble, he's the one who should be ashamed. Running off like a coward and leaving her to face the consequences alone." Ruby agreed, though it did not change anything. The young man in question, a traveling salesman named Robert Hayes, had disappeared before Sarah even knew she was pregnant. Ruby had tried to find him, had written letters to every town between Taylor and San Antonio, but he had vanished like smoke. She liked to imagine that someday he would hear about what happened to Sarah and feel the weight of his guilt, but she suspected he would never know and never care. The days passed slowly. Ruby worked in her garden, mended clothes, read books. She tried not to think about Austin Merrick riding back from Huntsville. She tried not to wonder if he would really come back to Taylor or if he had just been kind to her out of pity. She tried not to replay their conversations in her mind, looking for signs that he felt the same pull toward her that she felt toward him. But she thought about him constantly, about the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, about the gentle way he spoke about his mother, about the strength in his hands when he gripped the bars of her cell and leaned close to talk to her, about the way he had looked at her when she said she wanted to see him again, like she had just given him a precious gift. On the 8th day, Austin rode back into town. Ruby was hanging laundry in her yard when she heard the hoofbeats, and she looked up to see him coming down the road on his big roan horse. Her heart started pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. Austin dismounted and walked through the gate, pulling off his hat. "Hello, Ruby," he said, and his voice was warm and a little uncertain, like he was not sure of his welcome. "Hello, Austin," Ruby said, setting down her laundry basket. "Just how was the trip?" "Long and dusty," Austin said, "but successful. Garrett Pike is now a guest of the state of Texas for the next 5 years. With any luck, he'll learn something about honesty while he's breaking rocks in the sun." "I doubt it," Ruby said. "Men like that don't change." "You're probably right," Austin admitted. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly looking awkward. "Ruby, I've been thinking about you the whole ride back, and I need to know something. When you said you wanted to see me again, did you mean it? Or were you just being polite because I helped you?" Ruby felt a smile tug at her lips. Austin Merrick, I am not in the habit of saying things I don't mean. I wanted to see you again because when I'm with you, I feel like myself again. Like I'm not just the woman whose sister died or the woman who shot a man. I'm just Ruby. And that's a gift I did not expect to find. Austin's face lit up with a smile that made Ruby's breath catch. I feel the same way, he said. When I'm with you, I'm not just a bounty hunter or a man with a past. I'm someone who might have a future worth looking forward to. He stepped closer, and Ruby's heart was racing now. I know this is fast, Austin said. We've only known each other for a week and a half, but Ruby, I have never felt this way about anyone before. I think about you all the time. I want to know everything about you. I want to see where this goes between us. So do I, Ruby whispered. I was so afraid you would not come back. I will always come back, Austin said. And then he was cupping her face in his hands and kissing her, and Ruby felt like her whole body was on fire. It was her first real kiss, and it was everything she had imagined and more. Austin's lips were gentle but insistent, and he tasted like coffee and dust, and something uniquely him. Ruby kissed him back with all the pent-up longing and grief and hope that had been building inside her, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Stay, Ruby said impulsively. Stay in Taylor for a while. Don't ride off chasing the next wanted man just yet. I was planning on it, Austin said with a grin. I already rented a room at the boarding house. I'm not going anywhere. Over the next few months, Austin and Ruby fell into an easy rhythm. Austin took odd jobs around Taylor to pay his rent, working as a deputy for Marshal Donnelly and helping out at the blacksmith shop when they needed an extra pair of hands. Ruby started taking in sewing and mending to earn money, using the bookkeeping skills she had learned from her father to keep careful track of her finances. They saw each other every day, sometimes for just a few minutes and sometimes for hours at a time. They took long walks in the evening when the heat of the day had faded, talking about everything under the sun. Austin told Ruby about his years as a bounty hunter, about the dangerous men he had tracked and the close calls he had survived. Ruby told Austin about growing up in Taylor, about her father who had died of a heart attack when she was 19, about the dreams she and Sarah had shared of someday leaving Texas and seeing the ocean. Why didn't you go? Austin asked one evening, as they sat on Ruby's porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. I don't know, Ruby said. Fear, I suppose. And after Father died, there was the house to take care of and bills to pay. And then Sarah met Robert Hayes and fell in love. And she thought he was going to marry her and give her a better life. She did not want to leave Taylor while she was waiting for him to come back, and I could not leave her. You're a good sister, Austin said, taking her hand. I was not good enough, Ruby said, her voice breaking. If I had been paying attention, I would have known something was wrong sooner. I would have stopped her before she did something desperate. Ruby, you cannot blame yourself for Sarah's choices, Austin said firmly. She was an adult. She made a terrible decision and she paid for it, but that was not your fault. I know, Ruby whispered, but knowing it and feeling it are two different things. Austin pulled her close, and Ruby rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of leather and soap and sun-warmed skin. They sat like that until the stars came out, not needing words, just the comfort of each other's presence. As the weeks turned into months, Ruby's probation period came to an end without incident. She paid her $50 fine, and true to his word, Judge Blackwell expunged the assault charge from her record. Ruby Lancaster was officially free of all legal trouble, and she could finally begin to think about the future, instead of just surviving the present. She was also deeply, completely in love with Austin Merrick. She had not meant to fall so hard or so fast, but there was no fighting it. Austin was everything she had never known she wanted in a man. He was strong but gentle, brave but thoughtful, and he treated her like she was the most precious thing in his world. He made her laugh when she thought she had forgotten how. He held her when she cried. He listened to her dreams and told her they were possible, not foolish. And he loved her back. She could see it in the way he looked at her, in the way his whole face softened when she walked into a room. He said it out loud for the first time on a cool November evening when they were sitting by the creek on the edge of town. "I love you, Ruby Lancaster," Austin said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I've loved you since the first moment I saw you in that jail cell, scared and defiant and so damn beautiful. It hurt to look at you. I know I said I wanted to see where this goes between us, but I already know. I want to marry you. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy, if you'll have me." Ruby felt tears stream down her face, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you. I love you too, Austin. I love you so much it terrifies me." Austin kissed her then long and deep, and Ruby felt like her heart might actually explode from happiness. When they finally broke apart, Austin reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "It was my mother's," he said. "She left it to me when she died. I know it's not fancy, but it's the most precious thing I own." "It's perfect," Ruby said, and she meant it. Austin slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it had been made for her. They were married on a cold morning in December of 1882 in the same church where Ruby had stood trial 6 months earlier. Marshal Donnelly gave Ruby away since she had no male relatives left, and Mrs. Chen served as her witness. It was a small ceremony with only a handful of friends and neighbors in attendance, but it was perfect. Ruby wore a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, and Austin wore his best shirt and a nervous smile. When Judge Blackwell, who had agreed to officiate, pronounced them husband and wife, Austin kissed Ruby like she was the air he needed to breathe. The small congregation cheered, and Ruby felt a surge of joy so pure and strong that she thought she might float right up to the ceiling. They spent their wedding night in Ruby's little house, which was now their house, and Austin made love to her with a tenderness that made her weep. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Ruby felt more at peace than she had in years. "I wish Sarah could have met you," Ruby whispered into the darkness. "She would have liked you." "I wish I could have met her too," Austin said, stroking her hair. "But Ruby, I think she would be happy for you. I think she would want you to be happy." "I am happy," Ruby said, and she realized it was true. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it no longer consumed her. She had found a way to live with it, to carry it without letting it crush her, and she had Austin to help shoulder the weight. The next few years were the happiest of Ruby's life. Austin gave up bounty hunting and became Marshal Donnelly's permanent deputy, a job that kept him close to home and relatively safe. Ruby opened a small dress shop on Main Street, using her sewing skills and business sense to build a modest but successful enterprise. They saved every penny they could, dreaming of someday buying a larger house with room for a family. The family came sooner than expected. In the fall of 1883, Ruby discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified at first, remembering Sarah's fate, but Austin was overjoyed and so attentive that Ruby could not help but feel hopeful. The pregnancy was difficult with constant nausea and exhaustion, but Ruby was surrounded by support. Mrs. Chen checked on her daily. Austin hovered like a nervous mother hen. Even Marshal Donnelly brought by food and cheerful conversation. Their son was born in May of 1884, a healthy, squalling baby with Austin's dark hair and Ruby's green eyes. They named him Samuel, after Ruby's father, and Ruby felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. Holding her son for the first time, she understood in a new and visceral way what Sarah must have felt, carrying a child alone and terrified. It made Ruby's heart break all over again for her sister, even as she rejoiced in her own good fortune. Austin was a devoted father from the moment Samuel was born. He changed diapers and walked the floor with a crying baby at 2 a.m. He built a cradle with his own hands and painted it a cheerful yellow. He looked at his son with such fierce love that Ruby sometimes had to look away before she started crying from sheer happiness. When Samuel was 6 months old, Ruby decided it was time to do something she had been thinking about for a long time. She and Austin traveled to the cemetery where Sarah was buried, bringing flowers and a picnic lunch. They sat by Sarah's grave, and Ruby told her sister all about her life now, about Austin and Samuel and the dress shop, about how happy she was, and how she wished Sarah could have lived to see it. "I'm sorry I was not there when you needed me," Ruby said, her voice thick with tears. "I'm sorry you felt so alone, that you thought ending your pregnancy was the only option. I'm sorry Robert Hayes was such a coward. I'm sorry for all of it. But Sarah, I want you to know that I'm living now. Really living, not just surviving. And I think part of that is because of you. Because losing you taught me how precious life is, how fast it can be taken away. I don't take a single day for granted anymore. Every moment with Austin and Samuel is a gift, and I treasure it because I know how easily it could all disappear." Austin put his arm around her, and they sat there for a long time, the three of them and the memory of Sarah. When they finally left, Ruby felt lighter, like she had been carrying a weight she had not even known was there and had finally set it down. Life continued in its gentle rhythm. Samuel grew into a curious, energetic toddler who was constantly getting into mischief. Ruby's dress shop thrived, and she was able to hire a young woman named Emily to help with the sewing. Austin was promoted to chief deputy when Marshal Donnelly retired, and he proved to be fair and competent in the role. They saved enough money to buy a bigger house with a yard where Samuel could play and a garden where Ruby could grow vegetables and flowers. In 1886, Ruby became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in early 1887 she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah after Ruby's sister. Little Sarah had her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady gray eyes, and she was a calm, sweet baby who rarely cried. Samuel, now nearly 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything, from changing diapers to singing her lullabies. Watching her two children play together, Ruby sometimes felt a pang of bittersweet longing for the sister who would never meet them. But mostly she felt grateful. Grateful for the life she had built with Austin, grateful for the children who filled her days with joy and chaos, grateful that she had survived the worst year of her life and come out the other side stronger and happier. Austin seemed to feel the same way. "Sometimes I can't believe this is my life," he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Samuel chase fireflies while baby Sarah slept in Ruby's arms. "I used to think I would spend my whole life alone, chasing wanted men across Texas until I got too old or too slow and ended up dead in a ditch somewhere. I never imagined I could have this. A wife I love more than breathing. Children who make me want to be a better man. A home where I actually want to be at the end of the day. It's like a dream." "It's not a dream," Ruby said, leaning into his shoulder. "It's real. It's our life, and we built it together." "We did," Austin agreed, "and I would not change a single thing about it, not even the hard parts, because all of it led us here." "All of it," Ruby echoed, thinking about that terrible day in the street when she had shot Garrett Pike. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, like something that had happened to a different person. But it had happened to her, and it had brought Austin into her life, and she could not regret that no matter how much she regretted the violence itself. The years continued to pass in a blur of happy moments and everyday challenges. Samuel started school and proved to be a bright, energetic student who loved reading as much as his mother did. Sarah grew into a thoughtful, artistic child who was always drawing or singing or making up elaborate stories. In 1889, Ruby had another baby, a second son they named Matthew, and in 1891 she had one more child, a daughter they named Grace. 4 children kept Ruby and Austin busy from dawn until well past dark, but they would not have had it any other way. Their house was always full of noise and laughter and the comfortable chaos of family life. Ruby's dress shop continued to do well, though she had less time to spend there as her family grew. Austin was appointed marshal when his predecessor moved to San Antonio, and he proved to be respected and well-liked by the people of Taylor. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable. They had enough to eat and warm clothes in winter and a roof that did not leak. They had friends and neighbors who cared about them. They had a community where they belonged, and they had each other, which was more valuable than all the gold in Texas. On their 10th wedding anniversary in December of 1892, Austin surprised Ruby with a trip to Galveston to see the ocean. They left the children with Mrs. Chen, who was now in her 70s but still spry enough to manage 4 energetic youngsters for a few days. The journey was long and dusty, but when Ruby finally stood on the beach and saw the endless expanse of blue water stretching to the horizon, she burst into tears. "Sarah and I used to dream about this," she told Austin, her hand in his as they walked along the shore. "We would look at pictures and books and imagine what it would be like to see the ocean." She never got the chance. "But you did," Austin said gently, "and you can carry her with you. She's part of this moment, too." Ruby nodded, watching the waves crash against the sand. "I'm carrying her with me always," she said, "in the daughter we named after her, in the way I try to live my life with joy and purpose, in the way I love you and our children with everything I have because I know how fragile it all is." They spent 2 beautiful days in Galveston, walking on the beach and eating fresh seafood and staying in a hotel that felt impossibly luxurious after years of their modest home in Taylor. On their last night, they sat on the hotel balcony watching the moon reflect on the water, and Austin pulled Ruby into his arms. "I love you more now than I did the day we married," he said. "I did not think that was possible, but it's true. Every day with you is a gift, Ruby Merrick. Every single day." "I love you too," Ruby said, tilting her face up for a kiss. "Thank you for giving me this life. Thank you for loving me even when I was broken. Thank you for helping me heal." "You healed yourself," Austin said. "I just had the honor of being there to watch." They returned to Taylor refreshed and happy, and life resumed its comfortable pace. The children grew older. Samuel turned 10 and started helping his father at the marshal's office, learning about law and justice and what it meant to serve the community. Sarah turned 8 and began taking piano lessons, filling the house with music. Matthew at 3 was a handful, always climbing things and getting into mischief. And Grace as a baby was content to be passed from person to person, smiling at everyone with her toothless grin. Ruby's dress shop celebrated its 10th anniversary in 1893, and to mark the occasion, she held a sale that drew customers from 3 counties. Emily, who had been working for Ruby since the beginning, was now a partner in the business, and together they were considering opening a second location in Austin. It was a big risk, but Ruby had learned that sometimes the biggest rewards came from taking chances. Austin was content in his role as marshal, keeping the peace in Taylor and the surrounding area. The work was not glamorous, mostly settling disputes between neighbors and dealing with the occasional drunk cowboy, but it was satisfying. He had left behind the dangerous life of a bounty hunter and built something stable and safe for his family. He had no regrets. In 1895, when Ruby turned 35 and Austin was 41, they took stock of their lives and realized they had everything they had ever wanted: 4 healthy, happy children, a thriving business, a beautiful home, a community that respected them, and most importantly, they had each other. "Do you remember that day in the street?" Ruby asked one evening as they sat together after the children had gone to bed. "When I shot Garrett Pike and thought my life was over?" "I remember," Austin said. "I remember thinking you were the bravest woman I had ever seen, scared out of your mind but standing tall anyway." "I was not brave," Ruby said. "I was stupid and reckless and so consumed by grief that I could not think straight." "You were human," Austin corrected, "and you were defending someone you loved. There's no shame in that." "I'm glad you showed up when you did," Ruby said. "I think about that sometimes. What would have happened if you had ridden into Taylor a day earlier or a day later? If you had not been tracking Garrett Pike, if you had not decided to help me, my whole life could have gone a completely different direction." "Mine too," Austin said. "I could have spent the rest of my life alone, chasing bad men and never finding a reason to stop. Instead, I found you. I found a home. I found a purpose beyond just surviving." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of them thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. Finally, Ruby spoke again. "I'm happy. she said simply. Despite everything that happened, despite all the pain and loss, I'm happy. Is that wrong? Should I feel guilty for being happy when Sarah never got the chance? No, Austin said firmly. Sarah would want you to be happy. She would want you to have this life. And Ruby, you've honored her memory by living well, by choosing joy and love even when it would have been easier to give up. That's not something to feel guilty about. That's something to be proud of. Ruby leaned into Austin's embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. He was right, she knew. Sarah would want her to be happy. Sarah had always wanted the best for Ruby, even when her own life was falling apart. And Ruby had done her best to live a life that would make her sister proud. The years continued to unfold in a pattern of ordinary miracles. Samuel grew into a fine young man and decided to follow in his father's footsteps, becoming a deputy marshal at age 18. Sarah discovered a talent for painting and began selling her artwork to tourists who came through Taylor. Matthew settled down enough to become a skilled carpenter, learning the trade from the man who had built Ruby and Austin's house. And Grace, the youngest, proved to be brilliant with numbers and announced at age 12 that she wanted to go to college someday and become a banker. Austin and Ruby supported all their children's dreams, even the ones that scared them a little. They knew from hard experience that life was unpredictable and that holding on too tight would only push their children away. So they let Samuel patrol the streets of Taylor, even though Ruby worried every single day that something would happen to him. They encouraged Sarah's art even though there was no money in it. They supported Matthew's apprenticeship even though it meant he spent long hours away from home. And they promised Grace they would find a way to pay for college, even though they were not sure how they would manage it. In 1900, when Ruby was 40 and Austin was 46, they celebrated their 18th wedding anniversary by renewing their vows in the same church where they had been married. All 4 children stood up as witnesses, and half the town came to watch. It was a joyful, raucous celebration that lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more food than any reasonable group of people could eat. As Ruby danced with Austin under the stars, she thought about everything they had been through together. The fear and grief of those early days, the slow, steady building of a life, the joy of watching their children grow, the deep, abiding love that had only grown stronger with time. I would do it all again, she told Austin as they swayed to the music. Every moment, every hardship, every tear, I would do it all again to end up here with you. So would I, Austin said, kissing her forehead. So would I, my love. The new century brought changes to Taylor and to the Merrick family. The railroad came through town, bringing new businesses and new people. Ruby and Emily opened their second dress shop in Austin, and it was even more successful than the first. Samuel fell in love with a school teacher named Margaret and married her in a beautiful ceremony in the spring of 1902. Sarah sold her first major painting to a gallery in San Antonio and used the money to travel to New York City to study art. Matthew became a master carpenter and started his own business. And Grace, true to her word, went off to college in 1903, the first woman in the family to do so. Ruby and Austin found themselves with an empty nest for the first time in 20 years, and it was both strange and wonderful. They missed the chaos of having children at home, but they also enjoyed the freedom to focus on each other again. They took long walks every evening. They read books aloud to each other. They made love in the middle of the day just because they could. They rediscovered the easy intimacy that had first drawn them together all those years ago. In 1905, Samuel and Margaret gave Ruby and Austin their first grandchild, a boy they named Henry. Ruby held her grandson for the first time and wept with joy, marveling at the circle of life that had brought her from that dark place after Sarah's death to this moment of pure happiness. "Your great-aunt Sarah would have loved you," Ruby whispered to the baby. "She would have spoiled you rotten and taught you to be kind and brave. I'm going to tell you all about her when you're old enough to understand." Austin wrapped his arms around both of them, and Ruby felt complete in a way she had not known was possible. She had survived the worst thing she could imagine and come out the other side with a life richer and fuller than she had ever dreamed. She had found love in the midst of tragedy. She had built a family from the ashes of loss. She had honored Sarah's memory by living fully and loving deeply, and she was not done yet. There were more grandchildren to come, more years to share with Austin, more memories to make. The future stretched out before her full of possibility and promise, and Ruby embraced it with open arms and a grateful heart. Years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows. Sarah the artist returned from New York with a fiancé, a kind man named Thomas who worked as an art dealer. They married in 1906 and settled in Austin, close enough to visit but far enough to have their own lives. Matthew married a carpenter's daughter named Louisa in 1907, and they started a family immediately, giving Ruby and Austin 2 more grandchildren in quick succession. And Grace graduated from college in 1908 with honors and was hired by a bank in Houston, becoming one of the first female bank clerks in Texas. Through it all, Ruby and Austin remained the steady center of their growing family. They celebrated birthdays and holidays. They offered advice when asked and stayed quiet when it was not. They babysat grandchildren and listened to their adult children's problems and celebrated their successes. They grew older together, Austin's hair turning silver and Ruby's developing streaks of white, but their love remained as strong as ever. In 1910, on a warm spring evening, Ruby and Austin sat on their porch watching the sunset. They were both in their 50s now, their children grown and scattered across Texas, their grandchildren numbering 7 with more on the way. They held hands in comfortable silence, not needing words to communicate their contentment. "Do you ever think about that day?" Austin asked suddenly. "The day we met?" "I think about it all the time," Ruby admitted. "I think about how scared I was, how certain I was that my life was over, how you walked into that jailhouse and changed everything." "You changed everything for me too," Austin said. "Before I met you, I was just drifting. I had no home, no family, no purpose beyond the next bounty. You gave me a reason to stop running and start living." "We saved each other," Ruby said simply. "That's what love does. It saves us from ourselves." They sat there until the stars came out, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Their story was not the stuff of dime novels or grand legends. It was quieter than that, more ordinary, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that made it extraordinary. Ruby thought about Sarah often in those days, especially when she held her grandchildren or watched her children living their own happy lives. She hoped her sister could see her somehow, could know that Ruby had survived and thrived. She hoped Sarah was at peace wherever she was, and she knew deep in her bones that she had done right by her sister's memory. She had taken the grief and anger that nearly destroyed her and transformed it into something beautiful. She had loved and been loved. She had raised children who were good and kind. She had built a life worth living. On their 28th wedding anniversary in December of 1910, Austin gave Ruby a gift. It was a painting that Sarah had done years before, a portrait of Ruby and Austin together on their porch. Sarah must have painted it from memory, because Ruby had no recollection of posing for it. But the detail was incredible, capturing every line of Austin's face and every strand of Ruby's graying hair. At the bottom, Sarah had signed her name and written a single line, "To the greatest love story I ever witnessed." Ruby cried when she saw it, and Austin held her while she wept. "She knew," Ruby said through her tears. "She knew we were meant to be together." "Of course she knew," Austin said gently. "Everyone could see it. We were not exactly subtle." They hung the painting in a place of honor above the fireplace where Ruby could see it every day. It became a touchstone for her, a reminder of everything she had overcome and everything she had gained. When times were hard, she would look at the painting and remember that love was the strongest force in the universe, stronger than grief or fear or death itself. In the years that followed, Ruby and Austin watched their family continue to grow and flourish. More grandchildren arrived, each one a blessing. Samuel became Marshal of Taylor when Austin retired in 1912, proving himself to be fair and competent just like his father. The dress shops continued to thrive under Emily's management, giving Ruby time to pursue other interests. She started writing down the story of her life, thinking that someday her grandchildren might want to know where they came from and what their grandmother had survived. Austin took up woodworking in his retirement, crafting beautiful furniture for their children and grandchildren. His strong hands, which had once tracked dangerous men across Texas, now created cradles and rocking chairs and hope chests. He was content in a way he had never been during his bounty hunting days, and Ruby loved watching him work, seeing the concentration on his face as he shaped wood into something useful and beautiful. They had been married for 30 years when Austin fell ill in the winter of 1912. It started as a bad cold that would not go away, and by spring it had settled in his lungs. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and said there was nothing to be done but keep him comfortable and hope for the best. Ruby sat by his bedside day and night, holding his hand and reading to him and praying to a God she was not sure was listening. Austin recovered slowly, his strong constitution pulling him back from the brink of death. By summer he was up and walking again, though he was weaker than he had been before. Ruby thanked every deity she could think of for sparing her husband, and she vowed never to take a single moment with him for granted. "I'm not going anywhere," Austin told her when she confessed how terrified she had been of losing him. "I have too much to live for. I want to see all our grandchildren grow up. I want to grow old and gray with you. I want at least another 20 years of this beautiful life we have built together." "I'll hold you to that," Ruby said, kissing him. "Don't you dare leave me before we have had our fill of this life." Austin kept his promise. He regained his strength and health, and life returned to normal. They celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary in 1917, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends. The world was changing rapidly, with automobiles and telephones and even the distant rumblings of war in Europe, but Taylor remained much the same as it had always been. It was a good place to grow old, Ruby thought, a good place to watch the years unfold. In 1920, when Ruby was 60 and Austin was 66, they took another trip to Galveston to see the ocean. It was their first visit since their 10th anniversary, and so much had changed, but the ocean was still the same, vast and eternal and beautiful. They walked on the beach, hand in hand, older and grayer, but no less in love than they had been nearly 40 years ago. "Do you have any regrets?" Austin asked as they watched the waves. Ruby thought about the question carefully. "I regret that Sarah died so young," she said finally. "I regret that she never got to experience the kind of love we have. I regret shooting Garrett Pike, even though it brought us together. But do I regret the life we have built? Not for a single second. This has been a good life, Austin. The best life." "The best life," Austin agreed, "and it's not over yet. We still have time." They had 15 more years together, 15 years of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, of quiet evenings on the porch and lazy Sunday dinners with the whole family. They watched the world change around them, saw automobiles replace horses and electricity come to Taylor. They weathered economic hardships and celebrated new prosperity. They mourned the loss of friends and welcomed new ones. Through it all, they remained devoted to each other. Austin still looked at Ruby like she was the most beautiful woman in the world, even when her hair had turned completely white and her face was lined with age. Ruby still felt her heart skip a beat when Austin walked into a room, even after nearly 50 years of marriage. Their love had deepened and matured, becoming less about passion and more about profound partnership, but it had never diminished. Austin died peacefully in his sleep on a warm night in June of 1935 at the age of 81. Ruby woke to find him beside her, his hand still holding hers, his face relaxed and peaceful. She sat with him for a long time before calling for the children, memorizing every detail of his beloved face, saying goodbye to the man who had saved her life and given her everything she had ever wanted. The funeral was huge, with people coming from all over Texas to pay their respects to the man who had been Marshal of Taylor for so many years. But for Ruby, it was intensely personal. She stood by Austin's grave and spoke to him one last time, thanking him for 52 years of love and partnership, promising him that she would carry his memory with her for whatever time she had left. Ruby lived another 8 years without Austin, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She finished writing the story of her life and had it privately printed, giving copies to each of her descendants. She wanted them to know where they came from, to understand that even the darkest moments could lead to the most beautiful outcomes. On a crisp morning in October of 1943, Ruby Lancaster Merrick died quietly in her sleep at the age of 83. Her children buried her next to Austin in the Taylor Cemetery, not far from where Sarah was laid to rest. The three graves formed a small triangle, 3 lives forever intertwined by love and loss and the unbreakable bonds of family. At Ruby's funeral, her oldest son Samuel stood up to speak. He was an old man himself now, nearly 60, with children and grandchildren of his own. But when he talked about his mother, his voice was thick with emotion. "My mother taught me that love is the strongest force in the universe," Samuel said. "She taught me that even when life knocks you down, you get back up and keep going. She taught me that family is everything, that honoring those we have lost means living fully and loving deeply. She survived things that would have destroyed other people, and she came out the other side stronger and more compassionate. She built a legacy of love that will last for generations. And she did it all while being the best mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother anyone could ask for. We will miss her terribly, but we will honor her by living the way she taught us to live, with courage and grace and an open heart." The family gathered afterward at the house that Ruby and Austin had shared for so many years. They told stories and shared memories, laughing and crying in equal measure. They looked at the painting Sarah had done all those years ago, the portrait of Ruby and Austin on their porch, and marveled at how young their parents had been when it was painted. As the sun set on that October day, the family stood together in the yard and watched the sky turn orange and gold. 4 generations of Merricks, all descended from a woman who had almost lost everything in a moment of grief-fueled rage, and a man who had shown up at exactly the right time to save her. They were teachers and artists and carpenters and bankers. They were soldiers and farmers and shopkeepers and nurses. They were the living legacy of a love story that had started in a jail cell and lasted for 52 years. And somewhere perhaps Ruby and Austin and Sarah were together again, watching over the family they had created and smiling at the beautiful, complex tapestry of lives they had helped weave. The story that had begun with a gunshot and accusations and fear had ended with generations of love and happiness. It was not the ending anyone could have predicted on that hot day in Taylor, Texas in 1882, but it was the ending Ruby deserved, and it was perfect